August 9, 1945. A military transport plane descended through grey clouds toward the city of Hiroshima, carrying 5 of Japan's most brilliant nuclear physicists. Dr. Yoshio Nishina pressed his face against the small window, expecting to see the familiar grid of streets he had visited many times before. Instead, he saw nothing. Where a city of 350,000 people had stood just 3 days earlier, there was now a flat expanse of ash and rubble stretching to the horizon in every direction. The plane banked lower, and Nishina felt his stomach drop, not from the turbulence but from the sudden, crushing weight of understanding. These scientists had spent 5 years assuring military leaders that an atomic device was theoretically possible, but practically impossible to build during this conflict. They had calculated the industrial requirements, the centrifuges needed, the electrical power demanded, and concluded that no nation on Earth could achieve it before 1950 at the earliest. They were about to walk through the proof of how catastrophically wrong they had been. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the following 72 hours would shatter not only these physicists' scientific assumptions, but their entire understanding of industrial capability, national will, and the nature of modern research. They would discover that while they had been working with a few dozen researchers and limited resources, their American counterparts had employed over 125,000 people across 30 sites in 3 countries, spending the equivalent of $26 billion in modern currency. The gap they uncovered was not merely technological, it was civilizational, and recognizing it would transform how Japan understood its place in the post-conflict world. Dr. Yoshio Nishina was no ordinary physicist. At 55 years old, he had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen during the 1920s, corresponded with Einstein, and built Japan's first cyclotrons. He had established the theoretical framework for quantum electrodynamics alongside the greatest minds in Europe. When he had returned to Japan in 1928, he carried with him not just knowledge but relationships. He knew personally many of the scientists who were likely involved in whatever had destroyed Hiroshima. This made the mystery even more agonizing. How had his friends and colleagues achieved what he had deemed impossible? Sitting beside Nishina on that plane was Dr. Bunsaku Arakatsu from Kyoto Imperial University, a man who had studied under Einstein himself in Berlin. Behind them sat 3 younger physicists, Dr. Masa Takeuchi, who specialized in radiation detection, Dr. Jun Okada, an expert in isotope separation, and Dr. Satio Hayakawa, whose work focused on cosmic rays. Together they represented the finest scientific minds Japan had cultivated over 3 decades. They had been summoned by the military with a single directive: determine what had happened to Hiroshima and assess whether Japan could respond in kind. The plane touched down at a makeshift airstrip 15 kilometers from the city center. The original Hiroshima airfield no longer existed. A military vehicle was waiting, and as they drove toward Ground Zero, the scientists began taking notes. Nishina observed the strange pattern of destruction, buildings flattened in a perfect radial pattern, all pointing away from a single central location. He noted that concrete structures had survived better than wooden ones, but even reinforced buildings showed catastrophic damage. The shadows burned into stone steps told him the flash had been unimaginably bright and brief. Lieutenant Colonel Gruhl, a military liaison who had survived the event by being stationed outside the city, provided the first eyewitness account. He described the blinding flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a sound like the earth splitting apart. He spoke of a mushroom-shaped cloud rising 15 kilometers into the sky, visible from over 160 kilometers away. He described people with their skin hanging in sheets, others who seemed uninjured but collapsed and perished within days. His voice remained steady as he recounted these details, the way soldiers learn to do, but his hands trembled slightly. Nishina listened carefully, asking precise questions. How long between the flash and the sound? Approximately 30 seconds. What color was the fireball? White, then orange, then red. How long did the mushroom cloud take to form? Perhaps 10 minutes to reach its full height. Each answer confirmed what Nishina suspected. but desperately hoped was not true. These were not the characteristics of a conventional explosive, no matter how large. These were the signatures of nuclear fission. The team established their base of operations in a partially destroyed schoolhouse 3 kilometers from the hypocenter. They unpacked their instruments, Geiger counters, electroscopes, photographic plates, and collection containers. Dr. Takeuchi immediately began taking radiation readings, and the results were unambiguous. Background radiation in unaffected areas typically measured around 0.1 Röntgen. At the hypocenter, his instruments registered over 1,000 Röntgen, a level that would prove fatal to humans within hours of exposure. The entire city was radioactive. There could no longer be any doubt. That first evening, the 5 scientists sat in the ruined schoolhouse, illuminated by kerosene lamps, and confronted the magnitude of their miscalculation. Nishina had calculated in 1943 that producing enough enriched uranium for a single device would require 5,000 centrifuges operating continuously for several years, consuming more electricity than the entire Japanese national grid produced. He had similar estimates for plutonium production, requiring massive reactors and chemical separation facilities. Based on these calculations, he had told military leaders that Japan could not build an atomic device before 1953 at the earliest, and he had assumed America faced similar constraints. "We were not wrong about the physics," Nishina said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. "We were wrong about what they were willing to do." Dr. Arakatsu nodded slowly, understanding immediately what his colleague meant. The science of nuclear fission was well established. They had all read the same papers, performed the same calculations. The challenge had never been theoretical, it was industrial. Building an atomic device required transforming abstract physics into physical reality at an almost incomprehensible scale. Arakatsu picked up a piece of charred wood and turned it over in his hands. "They must have built cities just to build this device," he said. "Entire cities we have never heard of, filled with workers performing tasks they did not understand, all feeding into a single purpose." The next morning, the team split up to gather evidence. Dr. Takeuchi focused on radiation mapping, walking a grid pattern through the ruins with his Geiger counter, recording levels at each intersection. The data revealed a clear epicenter and a fall-off pattern consistent with an airburst at approximately 580 meters altitude. An explosion at that height would maximize the destructive radius while minimizing radioactive contamination of the ground, a technical refinement that spoke to sophisticated understanding and testing. Dr. Okada collected samples, melted roof tiles, fused sand, twisted metal, carbonized wood. Each sample would be analyzed for isotopic composition, which would reveal the nature of the nuclear fuel. Was it uranium or plutonium, natural or enriched? How efficient was the detonation? The answers would tell them not just what had happened, but how advanced the American program truly was. Dr. Hayakawa focused on photographic evidence, documenting the blast shadows that had been burned into surfaces. A person sitting on stone steps had left a pale shadow, where their body had blocked the thermal pulse. Everything around the shadow was darkened by the flash. A ladder leaning against a tank left a perfect silhouette. These shadows all pointed away from a single location in the sky, confirming the airburst and allowing triangulation of the exact detonation point. Meanwhile, Nishina and Arakatsu interviewed survivors, though this proved difficult. Many who had been close enough to provide useful technical details had not survived. Those who had survived were often in shock, their memories fragmentary. But slowly, a picture emerged. The device had detonated at 8:15 in the morning with no warning, no air raid sirens, no formation of aircraft. Witnesses reported seeing only a single plane, or perhaps 2 or 3. Nothing that would indicate an attack. This detail was significant. A conventional bombing raid required hundreds of aircraft to deliver enough explosives for major damage. A single plane destroying an entire city meant each device was self-contained, deliverable by existing aircraft without modification. The Americans could, in theory, produce and deliver these devices as rapidly as they could manufacture them. The strategic implications were staggering. On the second day, Dr. Okada made a crucial discovery. While analyzing melted sand samples using a portable spectrometer, he detected traces of uranium-235 far in excess of natural abundance. Natural uranium contained only 0.7% of the fissile isotope. This sample suggested enrichment to over 80%. This was weapons-grade material, pure enough for an efficient detonation, and producing it required separation techniques on an almost unimaginable scale. Nishina absorbed this information with the expression of a man watching his life's work crumble. He had built 2 cyclotrons in Japan, capable of separating uranium isotopes, but they could produce only micrograms per day. To accumulate the 64 kilograms necessary for a uranium device would have taken his laboratory approximately 10,000 years. The Americans had clearly found another method, either electromagnetic separation on a massive scale, gaseous diffusion, or some technique the Japanese had not even considered. Whatever it was, it represented an industrial infrastructure Japan simply did not possess. That evening, Nishina drafted his first report to the military command. His handwriting was steady, his language precise and scientific, but the implications were devastating. The Hiroshima device was unquestionably atomic in nature, he wrote. The technical sophistication indicated a development program far beyond initial estimates. Most importantly, there was no reason to believe the Americans possessed only one such device. They likely had more, and Japan had no defense against them, and no realistic prospect of developing a countermeasure. The response from military headquarters came the next morning, and it revealed the depth of denial that still gripped some leaders. Could the scientists be mistaken? Could this have been a conventional explosive of unusual power? Could Japan develop a defensive measure, perhaps a way to detonate the devices before they reach their targets? Nishina replied with barely concealed frustration. The evidence was incontrovertible. There were no countermeasures possible, and attempting to shoot down the delivery aircraft was futile because the devices could simply be set to detonate at any altitude. On the 3rd day, the scientific team made another critical observation. Despite the total destruction at the hypocenter, some structures had survived relatively intact. The Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, almost directly beneath the detonation point, still had its copper dome frame standing, though the building was gutted. Reinforced concrete buildings within a few hundred meters were damaged but not flattened. This told the physicists something important about the device's yield. Using the survival of certain structures and the destruction of others, Nishina calculated the explosive force at approximately 15,000 tons of conventional explosive, what would later be termed 15 kilotons. This was enormous, but not unlimited. Theoretical calculations suggested uranium devices could potentially yield hundreds of kilotons if designed differently. The Americans, it seemed, had built a working but not optimal device. They were still learning, still improving. Future devices would likely be more powerful, but it was Dr. Takeuchi's work on radiation casualties that revealed perhaps the most sobering aspect of this new technology. He documented survivors who had been outside the immediately fatal zones, but who were now experiencing strange symptoms: hair loss, bleeding gums, purple spots on the skin, plummeting blood cell counts. These people had received sublethal doses of radiation and were now developing what would later be called acute radiation syndrome. Many would not survive the coming weeks. This meant the device continued to harm even after detonation, through invisible penetrating radiation that damaged the body at the cellular level. Takeuchi recognized the symptoms from laboratory accidents with radioactive materials, but he had never seen them on this scale. He counted over 1,000 cases in the first 3 days, and more were appearing as people who had entered the city after the blast began to sicken. The city itself had become toxic, and it would remain so for years. On August 11th, as the team was preparing their comprehensive report, news reached them of a second atomic detonation, this time over Nagasaki. The details were still fragmentary, but the implications were clear. The Americans had not expended their only device on Hiroshima. They had a second, perhaps more. The possibility of negotiating from a position of strength, of demonstrating resolve until the Americans exhausted their atomic arsenal, had evaporated. Nishina immediately requested permission to travel to Nagasaki, but events were moving faster than any scientific investigation. By August 14th, Emperor Hirohito had made his decision. Japan would accept the Allied terms of surrender. The conflict would end. In the days that followed, as Nishina compiled his final report, he found himself reflecting on the decade-long journey that had led to this moment. He had begun Japan's nuclear research program in 1939, immediately after learning of fission experiments in Germany. He had understood instantly that controlled fission could produce enormous energy, and that uncontrolled fission could produce an explosion of unprecedented power. He had assembled the best physicists in Japan and set them to work. But from the beginning, the Japanese program had faced constraints that their American counterparts apparently had not. Funding was limited. Nishina's total budget over 6 years amounted to less than 2 million yen, equivalent to perhaps $500,000 American dollars. His staff numbered fewer than 100 researchers at peak capacity. He had no access to uranium ore, which had to be imported from occupied territories in small quantities, and with great difficulty. The electrical power required for isotope separation was unavailable because the military demanded all available electricity for conventional production. Most critically, the Japanese military had never truly committed to the atomic project. They funded it at minimal levels as a hedge, a possibility to be explored but not prioritized. Conventional forces absorbed nearly all resources because they could produce results immediately, while an atomic device remained theoretical. Military leaders asked Nishina repeatedly when he could deliver a working weapon, and when he answered honestly, 5 to 10 years at minimum, perhaps never with current resources, they allocated their budgets elsewhere. Now Nishina understood what the Americans had done differently. They had not treated the atomic project as one program among many. They had treated it as the program, the single most important military undertaking of the conflict, worth any expenditure. The Manhattan Project, as it would come to be known, had operated with virtually unlimited funding, the highest national priority, and the authority to commandeer any resource it required. When project leaders needed more electricity, they built new power plants. When they needed specialized factories, they constructed entire industrial cities from bare ground. When they needed workers, they recruited 125,000 people and bound them to secrecy. Nishina learned these details gradually over the following months, as occupation forces arrived and information began to flow. The scale astonished him. The Americans had pursued not one, but 3 different methods of producing fissile material simultaneously, unsure which would work best. They had built a gaseous diffusion plant in Tennessee that covered over 40 acres and consumed more electricity than Canada. They had built an electromagnetic separation facility nearby that used more silver than existed in the United States Treasury. They had borrowed 14,000 tons from government reserves and returned it after the conflict. They had built plutonium production reactors in Washington state that required the flow of the entire Columbia River for cooling. The city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, had not existed in 1942. By 1945, it had a population of 75,000 people, making it the 5th largest city in the state. Yet almost none of its residents knew what they were building. Workers performed specialized tasks in isolated sections, understanding only their small part of a vast machine. The secrecy was so complete that most workers only learned what they had been producing when the Hiroshima announcement was made. The plutonium production facility at Hanford, Washington, told a similar story. Built on a remote stretch of the Columbia River, it employed 51,000 workers at its peak and included 3 full-scale nuclear reactors and massive chemical separation plants. The site covered nearly 600 square miles. When Nishina learned that the first reactor there had been built in just 11 months, he felt something close to despair. His own cyclotrons had taken years to construct with far simpler requirements. And then there was Los Alamos, the laboratory where the device itself had been designed and assembled. Hidden on a mesa in New Mexico, it had gathered many of the finest physicists in the world, including several whom Nishina knew personally from his time in Europe. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman. They had solved problems in months that Nishina had assumed would take decades. The implosion design used for the plutonium device was particularly ingenious, using precisely shaped explosive lenses to compress a plutonium core to supercriticality. Japanese physicists had not even considered this approach. Perhaps most remarkable was what the Americans had done just to test their first device. In July 1945, 1 month before Hiroshima, they had detonated a plutonium device in the New Mexico desert simply to confirm their design would work. They had called it Trinity, and it had yielded 20 kilotons, larger than the Hiroshima device. They had vaporized the test tower and created a crater of radioactive glass 300 meters wide, and they had done this merely as a dress rehearsal. Nishina calculated later that the total American expenditure on atomic development equaled the cost of building approximately 2,000 long-range aircraft. It represented not a project, but a national commitment. Backed by industrial capacity, Japan could not have matched even with unlimited motivation. The United States had produced more steel in 1944 than Japan had produced in its entire history. It had more electricity generating capacity, more scientific equipment, more trained engineers, more of everything. The atomic device was not an anomaly. It was an expression of overwhelming industrial supremacy made manifest in the most concentrated form possible. This realization brought Nishina to a deeper understanding, one that went beyond the specific question of atomic development. Japan had entered the conflict believing that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that determination and sacrifice could compensate for inferior resources. This belief had been tested and found wanting in every theater of the conflict, but never so dramatically as at Hiroshima. The atomic device represented industrial civilization in its most distilled form, pure scientific knowledge translated through mass production into absolute power. Against such a force, courage was simply irrelevant. Nishina spent the autumn of 1945 writing his comprehensive analysis of the atomic attacks and their implications. His report ran to over 200 pages and represented the first detailed Japanese scientific assessment of nuclear weapons. He described the physical evidence, calculated the yields, analyzed the production requirements, and projected future developments. He predicted that within 20 years, devices yielding millions of tons equivalent would be possible, delivered by missiles across continents in minutes. He was essentially correct. But Nishina's report also contained something unexpected. Hope. Not the false hope of catching up or striking back, but a genuine hope that emerged from the very extremity of what had been demonstrated. Atomic energy, Nishina wrote, represented either the end of civilization or its transformation. The same energy that had destroyed Hiroshima could power cities, desalinate water, propel ships and aircraft, and advance medical treatment. Japan had been 10 years behind in using this energy for destruction. It could choose to lead in using it for creation. This vision would guide the remainder of Nishina's life. He threw himself into building Japan's peaceful nuclear program with the same intensity he had once devoted to weapons research. He established new research institutes, trained a generation of nuclear engineers, and advocated tirelessly for international scientific cooperation. He saw the atomic device not as a final verdict on Japan's capabilities, but as a turning point, a shock that could redirect national energies toward more constructive purposes. Not all his colleagues shared this optimism. Dr. Arakatsu fell into a depression from which he never fully recovered, burdened by what he saw as his failure to anticipate American capabilities. Dr. Okada left physics entirely, becoming a Buddhist priest. Others scattered into various fields, some refusing to discuss their wartime work for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact of having been so wrong about something so consequential affected each man differently. But among those who continued in nuclear research, a remarkable pattern emerged. Freed from military direction and secrecy, they collaborated more openly, shared results more readily, and thought more creatively. Within 5 years, Japan had more operational cyclotrons than at any point during the conflict. Within 10 years, Japanese physicists were making significant contributions to international nuclear science. Within 20 years, Japan had the third largest peaceful nuclear program in the world. The physicists who walked through Hiroshima's ruins in August 1945 had discovered more than a new weapon. They had discovered the gap between what a society believes it can accomplish and what it can actually accomplish when fully committed. They had discovered the power of treating science not as an academic pursuit but as a national purpose. And they had discovered, most painfully, the cost of underestimating an opponent's determination and resources. Nishina lived until 1951, long enough to see the first peaceful nuclear reactor proposals, but not their realization. On his deathbed, he was still dictating papers on cosmic ray research. His mind sharp and curious until the final hours, his legacy was not the weapon he failed to build, but the scientific culture he helped create, one that would make Japan a leader in nuclear physics, electronics, and dozens of other fields within a generation. The lesson of Hiroshima for these scientists was not simply that they had been behind. It was that the nature of the gap mattered more than its size. They had been 10 years behind, not because Japanese physicists were less intelligent or less dedicated, but because the American system had mobilized resources in ways the Japanese system had not imagined possible. Closing such a gap required not just better science but a different relationship between science, industry, and national purpose. In the decades that followed, Japan would internalize this lesson profoundly. It would build technical universities, fund industrial research, and cultivate ties between academia and manufacturing that became models for the world. It would transform itself from a nation that had underestimated industrial capacity into one that became synonymous with it. The physicists who examined Hiroshima's ruins had seen the future, and though it had initially appeared as destruction, they helped their nation rebuild it as something else entirely. Every year on August 6th, survivors and descendants gather at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, the building whose skeletal dome still stands, preserved as Nishina first saw it. They come to remember those who perished, to advocate for a world without nuclear arms, and to reflect on what humanity proved capable of building and what it must now prove capable of preventing. The atomic age that began with Hiroshima has not ended. If anything, its dangers have multiplied. But so has the understanding that science and industry, fully mobilized, can achieve almost anything, for destruction or for creation, for despair or for hope. Dr. Yoshio Nishina understood this duality better than most. He had spent years trying to build a device of terrible power, failed, and then spent his remaining years trying to harness the same energy for peaceful purposes. He had walked through the proof of human destructive capacity and emerged determined to demonstrate human creative capacity. He had seen his nation's scientific limitations exposed and dedicated himself to erasing them. His story, and the story of his colleagues who examined Hiroshima's ruins, is ultimately not about being behind. It is about what happens next. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.